There we go. Finally got it. All right. Well, I'm going to try to very carefully tonight to watch for people coming in because I think I missed a person or two last time. And so I'm going to kind of keep an eye on that as well. But we had some audio problems last time. I'm going to keep it to 1 hour this time. And I'm going to try to pick up more or less where we left off. But there are some comments that I want to make that I'm not sure that I did make before. So I'm going to pop into the PowerPoint presentation that I was using. Um, in just a second here.
Participants and let them in if you want. It looks like it. I said participants and it shows the panel.
Yeah. And I've got 6 right now, and I'm not having anybody that's popping in. So I do have it showing though.
I'll keep an eye on that for you. So,
Okay, thank you. I would appreciate that. So I'm going to go ahead and share the PowerPoint. And I'm going to start out with Hestia here. A comment that I don't think I explained in detail here. Hestia was too important to the daily Greeks to have her mixed into the mythology very much. She's the goddess of the hearth, which is the center of the home because uh, the hearth was how they heated the home, so it had to be centrally located um, to provide heat evenly throughout as much of the home as possible. So she's the goddess of the hearth, which really means that she's the goddess of the home. So she had a lot of respect. She's one of the 3 virgin Olympians, and that may be actual virgin or just referring to virtuous. And then they love to put opposites together. So a virgin Olympian, she's a goddess of childbirth. Well, she she is the Olympian goddess of childbirth. Another lesser goddess, Alithia, is the actual goddess of childbirth itself. But the one point I wanted to make on this particular slide, and I'm not running the slide as such yet. I guess I could do that. I can go ahead and do that. Hang on here. Okay, so um, the point that I wanted to make is that she is sacrificed to at each meal. And what the way it worked is that each person had an assigned place at the table. And at least in the earlier stages of the development of that culture, they didn't have individual plates. The food was brought to the table on platters, and then each person had a place at the table, and they simply removed the food to the table. And you actually see that if you've ever seen the Lord of the Rings, when the one king is sitting there eating and he's pulling things onto the table. That's very much what the Greeks did. And so what they did to sacrifice to her at each meal, and it was like saying grace. What they did was to pour out a small amount of wine and a morsel or two of the food at the place that was reserved for Hestia. And that was a sacrifice to Hestia. Okay, so I talked about Persephone and talked about all of that, and Dionysus, um, god of the vine, and drama developing through his spring festival. It was originally a poetry contest for the prize of a goat or tragos. And excuse me, some of the poets began hiring actors or creating actors to play parts, and the drama evolved. And from tragos, because most of these dramas were about tragic events, from tragos we get tragedy. Okay, now I think this is about where we went bad with the sound and stuff. So I'm going to go quickly through these, and I'm going to start with the centaurs. 4-legged, part horse, part man. Probably comes from the first individuals who saw a rider on a horse from a distance and confused the rider and the horse as a single creature. And that's one of the few theories anyway, about how some of these monsters in mythology come about. And some of the monsters are bad and some of them are not bad. And we'll talk about that a little bit. It's the body of a horse with the waist up of a man where the neck of the horse begins. These centaurs, for the most part, were crude, not very bright. They had a human head, but they were not the brightest crayon in the box. There is one exception, though. The one good, kind, and wise centaur is Chiron. And Chiron, not to be confused with Charon, very different character, but Chiron is the teacher of many of the heroes and raises them in some cases and teaches them the various arts of war and philosophy and all these different things. Yeah, so he was the good, kind, and wise centaur who was the teacher. Seleni were two-legged, part man, part horse, and then basically the hindquarters of a horse and the waist up of a man. Sometimes it included horses' tails and horses' ears, or one or the other. Satyrs are part man, part goat. An extreme satyr, there's two different categories, extreme and lesser, and everything in between, to be honest with you. Extreme satyrs have the legs, hooves, tail, ears, and horns of a goat. Lesser satyrs may have as few as one goat-like feature, just goat's ears or goat's horns or maybe just hooves, etc. And their range ran anywhere from extreme to lesser. The most important satyr is Pan. And Pan is an extreme satyr. His name means all. He represents all of nature, and he's the son of Hermes. He's the main satyr in mythology. When a particular satyr needs to play some role, it's almost always Pan. He is a great musician, and his primary instrument is the syrinx, or panpipes. And the story about how he came to those was that, quite frankly, satyrs are horny little creatures that, because they're ugly, the nymphs run from them usually. And so the satyrs seldom capture a nymph. And he pursued a nymph named Syrinx. And she could see that he was going to catch her, so she prayed to the gods to save her, and they changed her into a tuft of reeds on the edge of the river that she was standing by. And so he could not take her as a nymph, but he cut the reeds and he made the first panpipes from them. And panpipes are a flute-like instrument with these tubes of different length. And you've no doubt heard them at some point and probably seen them before. The Christian concept of the physical description of the devil, most scholars attribute to the physical description of Pan. So the Christian concept of the devil is Pan made wicked. Pan was not wicked in Greek mythology. Eros. The Romans called him Cupid. And he's sometimes the son of Aphrodite, sometimes by the father being Ares, which the Greeks love to put opposites together. So here we have the goddess of love and the god of war yielding this little god of love. Sometimes he's just a young companion of Aphrodite and not her son. He's always shown in Greek mythology as an adolescent youth. They always talk about the fuzzy dew of youth on his cheeks. He's just coming into his beard. The Romans, with Cupid, came up with the idea of a winged baby. They took that concept of youth and took it to a more extreme position. So you'll see Cupids, plural, because the artists, especially during the Renaissance period, chose to represent many Cupids within their paintings. There really is only one, and Eros is the god of love, of romantic love. And the word erotic and etc. comes from that particular facet of this god. Silenus. Silenus is sometimes the son, sometimes the brother of Pan. He is not a satyr, though. He's the teacher of Bacchus, who was also called Dionysus. He was the teacher of that individual, that god. And he's shown in mythology always, as, especially after he's taught Dionysus, as a fat old man who's too drunk to walk, so he rides a donkey. And that is how he is shown in mythology almost all of the time. Aeolus. Aeolus is the chief wind god. And there's a different god for each direction the wind might blow, and we'll talk about the four major directions. But Aeolus is the chief wind god, and an Aeolian harp is a set of strings that have beads that when the wind blows, they tap against the strings. And that's called an Aeolian harp. We have one that was mounted on a door. So when the door opened or closed, the beads tapped against the strings. But that is known as an Aeolian harp. Boreas is his Roman name is Aquilo, and he is the rough north wind. This is not a good wind. This is a wind that brings the cold, and it's not favorable for the kinds of sailing that they need to do for their ships, etc. So it's rough north wind. And we get Boreas. Boreal is north, is the Greek word for north. So Boreas is the wind from the north. Eurus. Eurus is the same in Roman as it is in Greek. And it's the east wind. This one also is not favorable for most of the trade that they do, except coming back with empty ships, etc., from trips to particularly to the Black Sea. But the Greeks, their ships lacked articulated sails, so they really had a hard time tacking into the wind. They could um, slant the sail to a certain extent, but very often, if they couldn't get a favorable wind, they had to row. And the ships usually hugged the coastline and did their trading along the coastline. But we know for sure, and I use it in my books as well, that they did do some open water sailing. And that has been documented. And I use it extensively in the books that I write. So let's see here. Notice. Notice's Roman name is Auster. It's the hot, dry south wind, also not a good wind that dries things out, etc. So this is a wind that's not favorable. And that brings us to the one very favorable wind, Zephyr. His Roman name is Favonius, and he's the gentle west wind, and he's the best wind for the trading that they do. And so Zephyr is very favored by the Greeks, and we see that reflected in the stories. The Sirens, they are a group of women who sang sailors to their deaths. Apparently, they didn't like sailors. Actually, what they represent is areas along the coast where there's rocky coastline and shipwrecks occur when they hit rocks that are below the surface. And the story of sirens is to explain why those ships crashed on those rocks when they should have been probably a little farther out to sea. They originally are represented as birds with women's heads, but they changed over time and eventually became women to the waist and fish below the waist, in other words, mermaids. So that is how they're more commonly known in mythology. There's no more than three in any one story, and that has to do with the Greeks' love of the number three as a base, as the representation of stability. And I'm not sure I explained that particular element in the last session, but the reason three represents stability is that a stool with one leg cannot stand, nor can a stool with two legs, but a stool with three legs can stand, and so that's the stability element. And that is what most of their chairs, or many of their chairs anyway, were. They were tripods, that is, three-footed, three-legged. And so, for instance, the oracle at Delphi, the Pythoness, the oracle, the person who gives the pronouncements, etc., sits on a tripod. And she sits on a tripod that's over a crack in the earth. There's some dispute about this, but there's some theory that says that at one time there was a spring in that crack in the earth, and that the chemical analysis of the material in that ground suggests that there might have been in this heated spring, there might have been a hallucinogenic uh, fog coming out of that spring. The other explanation for the oracle making pronouncements so boldly and specific was that she chewed on laurel leaves, which also could have contributed to a hallucinogenic state, or at least suspending common sense, I guess. However, there are 10 sirens that are named in mythology, only 3 of them at a time in a story, but there are 10 of them that are actually named. And some of these names are names that you'll see again in other groups of women, Parthenope being one of them. But this group are the 10 names that are documented in the myths that we see. The Fates. They're called the Morai by the Greeks. The Romans called them the Parsi, and from that we get the word the term the Fates. The Romans also called them the Feta, which is where Fates came from. Feta was like a slang term for them. And the 3 members are Clotho, and she's the spinner of the thread of life for every individual alive. So when a person is born, she begins spinning the thread of their life. And from that, we get clothes and cloth and all the words that represent that which is spun and turned into clothing, etc. So she's the spinner. Lachesis is the measurer. And what she does is she measures the length of the thread of each person's life. And at the point that she indicates the thread must end, Atropos, whose name means the shearer, uses the scissors to cut the thread of life, and that brings death. So Atropos is sometimes seen as the angel of death. The Gree. These are 3 sisters again, Dino, Ennio, and Pimfredo. They shared an eye, and sometimes they shared a tooth. I'm not sure what that is about. I've never figured out the symbolic element of sharing a tooth. The eye was easy. The eye actually was a crystal ball, which allowed them to see the future and to see physically, but to see the future. They shared it by passing it from one to the other, and they held it to their eye socket and could see, and they could, among other things, prophecy with that. And that's used in the Perseus myth, and he's directed to steal the eye of the Gree and hold it as ransom to find out what he needs to know to continue his journey. They're called the Gray Women, the Gray Sisters, and the Stygian Witches. They're called Stygian Witches because they live on an island in the river Styx, which is in the underworld. And the Styx is an important river in the underworld. The Erinyes. These are referred to by Romans as the Furia, and we in English then we call them the Furies. There's sometimes 3, sometimes more, but they're sisters. And Alecto, Tisiphone, and Megara are the 3 dominant ones, the ones more commonly identified in mythology. They're usually shown pursuing those who commit blood murder, who kill a relative. Now, the reason for this is quite simple. Justice at this point in ancient Greece was revenge. So if you killed somebody in somebody's family, they would kill somebody in your family, not necessarily you, because the pain of losing a loved one is worse than losing your own life. So justice was usually involved in killing someone within their family. But what do you do when somebody kills someone within their family? Kill somebody else in that family? It doesn't make sense. So what they had was the Erinyes. And if someone committed blood murder, then the Erinyes would drive them insane and drive them to suicide. They had a euphemism, that is, the Greeks called them the Eumenides, meaning kindly ones, in order to try to keep them kindly by calling them that. Didn't work most of the time. The Graces. The Graces, again, are three sisters, Aglaia, Euphrosyne, and Thalia. Aglaia means brightness, Euphrosyne is joyfulness, and Thalia means blooming. And you'll see that name Thalia and I think Aglaia come in other groups as well. They're always mentioned together. They're like inseparable. It's kind of like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern in Shakespeare, and they're never separate. They're always together. They come as a set. Same is true with the Graces. They do reside in Olympus, but they are responsible for all that is charming in women. And so the women of Greece called upon the Graces frequently. The Muses are the daughters of Zeus by Mnemosyne. Mnemosyne is a Titan goddess of memory. And the reason for that is that the Muses represent the various artistic forms, and all these artistic forms, for the most part, require memorizing things. And so because they were not at this point in the early stages writing. They were not writing things down. So memory and oral recitation were the key. And so Mnemosyne is the goddess of memory, Titan goddess of memory. There are nine sisters, that magic number three, or multiples of three, so it's nine sisters, and they're the goddesses of poetic inspiration for the most part. Calliope is the chief muse, and she is the muse of eloquence and heroic poetry. Clio is the muse of history, and we have the first attempts at history with the ancient Greeks, at least in the Western civilization, with, for instance, Herodotus and others. And Clio is that muse that oversaw the use of history. Erato is the muse of lyric or erotic poetry. Euterpe is the muse of music. Melpomene is the muse of tragedy. Polyhymnia is this muse for sacred poetry, and polyhymnia actually means, the word means many hymns. Terpsichore is the muse of dance, and from that we get choreography and other forms of dance. Thalia, that name that we saw earlier, is the muse of comedy. And when you see representations of masks, and I'll explain the masks in a minute, but when you see representations of masks from ancient Greece, representing drama, you'll see one with a frowning face and tears, and one with a smile. Well, those are Thalia, and I'm trying to remember here. Oh, Melpomene, and Melpomene. And then Urania is the muse of astronomy and astrology. And the Greeks were very much into forming constellations in the sky, studying the sky. And because they were very involved in maritime trade, the stars were very important to them for navigating at night. The Gorgons. The Gorgons are three sisters, and only one of them is mortal. The other two are immortal. And immortal does not necessarily mean they can't die. It's that they don't die normally. Immortals can sometimes be killed. Very often, however, they can be killed and then they come back to life. So that's birth, death, and resurrection. And that's the case with Dionysus and Persephone, are both representative of that element. But the three sisters are the Gorgons, are Medusa. She's mortal. Her name means the queen. Stheno, which means the mighty, and Euyale. I can never say this one, but at any rate, means the far springer. And seeing them turns any living creature into stone. Now, actually, in the mythology, the explanation is that Medusa was originally a beautiful woman, and she drew the interest of Poseidon, and that it irritated Athena usually in the story, and Athena then changed her into a horrible being, serpent, usually shown as serpent below, from the waist below, and then a woman from the waist up, but the hair is living, writhing snakes. And then her sisters were turned as well. Seeing them turns any living creature to stone. Iris. Iris is the messenger god. Her name means rainbow. It's the Greek word for rainbow. And that's why the flowers are called iris, because they had come in so many different colors. She specializes in less important messages than Hermes takes care of. Hermes is the Olympian messenger god. He specializes in real important stuff, from gods to heroes and gods to gods. Iris brings messages usually from the gods to common mortals, etc. She uses the rainbow as the staircase to descend from Olympus, and that's why her name is associated with this. Proteus. He's a lesser sea god, but he's important in some of the myths. He readily changes shape. He has the ability to change shape, and he can change quickly, and he can become just about anything. He had the ability to see the future, so he could see prophecy. And so very often individuals would come to Proteus and try to find something out. He would refuse to tell them anything, and they would, Odysseus, for instance, was told to grab him and to not let go until he got the information that he needed. And Proteus began changing as soon as Odysseus grabbed him, and he changed into a tree and running water and all kinds of things. But Odysseus hung on until Proteus was at least finally forced to tell him what he needed to know. Triton is the son of Poseidon and Amphitrite. Amphitrite is a minor sea goddess, and she is usually depicted as the wife of Poseidon. And I chose her name, Amphitrite, for the name of the ship that is prevalent in my book, Sinon of Kira, the first major ship. And it's a large merchant marine ship named after Aphrodite to gain the favor of Poseidon. He's the trumpeter of the sea, and he uses a conch shell. And I actually have a conch shell that's been drilled out, and you can blow on it, and it sounds kind of like a muted trumpet. Leda. Leda is the wife of King Tyndareus, and King Tyndareus is the king of Sparta. And she is raped by Zeus, even though she's married to Tyndareus. She's raped by Zeus, and he takes the form of a swan, and he rapes her as a swan. And this is actually depicted. This event draws heavily from artists and poets, etc. And there's poetry about it, and there's paintings of this event, etc. And the reason for it is that the key players for the Trojan War come from this rape. She gives birth to two eggs. And in one egg are the two children of Tyndareus, but the other egg has the two children of Zeus. Castor is the son of Leda and Tyndareus. In other words, he's mortal because they're both mortal, obviously. And by the way, I haven't made that comment. A mortal and a mortal will always yield a mortal. An immortal and an immortal will almost always yield an immortal. But when you mix them, mortal and immortal, and it doesn't matter which male or female, they could be either. And one other thing is mortals can be made immortal. And there's a process for that usually involves fire, but also involves, for instance, drinking some nectar which is the drink of the gods, the wine of the gods, and eating ambrosia, which is the food of the gods. And so when they are given that, when a mortal is given that opportunity, they can become immortal. So at any rate, Castor is mortal. Polydeuces. Polydeuces, also called Pollux, is the son of Leda and Zeus, and of the 4 children that come from this rape, he's the only one that is immortal to begin with. His immortality, he chooses at one point. He and Castor are considered twins. They're called the Dioscuri, the twins. And even though they have different fathers, they're born from the same event, different eggs, but the same event. And so these 2 twins get into fight with another set of twins, Idas and Lynceus. And I can't remember the exact order, but Castor kills, I think it was Idas, and then Idas kills Castor, and then Polydeuces kills Lynceus. All right, so now Castor's dead, but Polydeuces, or Pollux, chooses to share his immortality with his son. Some of the myths, he has to share it by being immortal one day and mortal the next, and they are opposite each other so that when he's immortal, Castor is mortal, and then they flip. On the other hand, in some cases, they show them as both being immortal one day and mortal the next. But he shares his immortality with his brother. Clytemnestra. Clytemnestra is the daughter of Leda and Tyndareus, and she is the firstborn of the 4 children, and that's an important element. So because she's of Leda and Tyndareus, she is mortal. She is married to King Agamemnon of Mycenae. And I'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to Helen. But she is married to King Agamemnon of Mycenae, so she becomes the queen of Mycenae. And she doesn't like him. And in most of the myths, she is raped by him. And then when her brothers, uh, Polydeuces and Castor, come to kill Agamemnon for the rape, he flees to Tyndareus and begs for him to call his sons off, at which point Agamemnon says, okay, but you have to marry Clytemnestra. Now, this ancient Greek society, male-dominant society, didn't have a problem with forcing this woman to marry the man that raped her. Um, but she never forgets that. She becomes a dutiful wife for a long time. But later, in an event related to the Trojan War, she gets revenge against Agamemnon. Helen. Come on. Oh, my computer's going to hold back on me here. Okay. She's the daughter of Leda and Zeus. She is not immortal. She is born mortal. But she is also, because she's the daughter of Zeus, the most beautiful woman in the world. Now, this sets things up for the Trojan War, which I'll get into in more detail at some point. But the bottom line is this: Helen, being the most beautiful woman in the world, is not the oldest daughter, and the oldest daughter has to be married first. And so Clytemnestra is married off to Agamemnon, and Helen then is married to her husband, who becomes king. It's the brother of Menelaus, and I'm sorry, with brother of, I've got them mixed up here. At any rate, she becomes the queen of Sparta because her husband assumes the throne when Tyndareus passes. Okay. She married Menelaus of Sparta, as I spoke of that. And Agamemnon and Menelaus are brothers. Agamemnon is the king of Mycenae. Menelaus becomes, and he's a younger brother than Agamemnon, Menelaus becomes the king of Sparta. Now, this means that these 2 brothers at this point, because we're talking about this particular part of the Bronze Age, they are the two brothers that control the two most powerful cities of ancient Greece. Okay, so I'm going to come back off of things here. Stop share. All right, I'm back. So I want to pause at this point. I sent to you all an email today with the next 3 chapters that are involved in the Greeks and Their Mythology book that I put together for that class. And we'll be able to get into some of that with the next session, if indeed we do another session, which I hope we do. And I'm thinking right now, as I looked at the calendar today, that this probably happen like once a month. So I will try to choose a date and try to get it out to you in time to make that work. But what I'd like to do for right now is I would like to invite a discussion or questions about anything that I've covered, because I've introduced you to the primary players, the characters that we're going to be dealing with in a lot of this mythology. And I welcome at this point any questions that you might have about any of the characters or any of the cultural elements that we've referred to or otherwise that I may be able to address. And
You,
just go ahead and unmute and jump in.
I'm
Go
kind of
ahead, Linda.
curious about why I noticed that over and over and over they were 3 sisters. You explained the 3, but there seems to be a predominance of female characters. Was that, I mean, there's a few men, but not as many, it seems like, as the women.
And that's a good point. And yes, the 3 is most often associated with the women that we find in Greece. However, remember that, for instance, among the 12 Olympians, the 3 brothers are Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. So they are 3. Um, so 3 does happen outside of that, but this male-dominant society tends to group women in groups that they can name, graces and furies and what have you. So it's just an element of what their culture was about.
And they seem to be grouped according to, let's see, what would I call them? I mean, the men are given um, meaning too, I mean, a major role or a particular role, but that seems to be individually assigned. Whereas with the 3 sisters, there are 3 of each of these types.
Yes, yes, and they are grouped by their deeds or by their occupation, I guess we'll call it. So graces, the all that is charming in women, the sirens, and all of that. That's true, but do remember that the Olympian goddesses have the same individuality as the Olympian gods. So they have very clear attributes. And it's interesting because this male dominant society, they keep putting in juxtapositioning things. So, for instance, Artemis is the huntress for the gods. Well, hunting in a male dominant society is a male role, but they give it to a goddess. And that's just something that the Greeks repetitively do. They like to juxtaposition these apparent um, conflicts.
Interesting.
Yeah. Other questions, comments, anything?
I'd sort of forgotten how many basically understudy type gods there were.
Oh yeah, there are a ton. We have not gone into the host of them, and there are just Alithia is the goddess of childbirth. She serves under Hestia. There's a whole set of goddesses, and gods that serve under all of these different gods. So when you have an Olympian god such as Apollo. He has a whole crew of individuals that are each responsible for some specific element. For instance, Pan is serving under Apollo. Apollo is the god of musicians. Well, Pan is the primary musician. In fact, there's a story in there where they get into a contest to see who is the best musician. And Apollo is awarded that, but only because he's the Olympian. He was outdone by Pan.
Is there some kind of philosophical discussion by some of the later Greeks and that would say um, why each of these individuals have to be associated with a particular function, or was it just so the people would know if they wanted to get a favor done, they'd know which person to go sacrifice to, or was there a deeper, more meaningful reason for
It
group?
actually had more to do with the evolution of these individual gods. What we have is, with Greek mythology, is we have a collection that's um, a full array of individuals. But most of these gods come from specific areas. And for instance, Apollo is considered the most Greek of the gods. Isn't even Greek in origin. He came from the Eastern civilizations, and then was Grecoized, was made Greek. When you take a look at the statues of ancient Greece, of the gods, um, Zeus, Hephaestus, um, Ares, the rest of them, bulky muscles, big, strong individuals that the Romans really relate to because the Romans wanted to conquer the world. Apollo is always shown more effeminate. He's lighter in his overall build. When you take a look at the statues, they are his muscle build is not bulk; it is muscle of tone, and so he's associated with athletes because he is athletic in his appearance, etc. And he actually, some of the statues actually make his face effeminate. And so he comes from an Eastern culture and then is made Greek. But for instance, Zeus probably came from the island of Crete in terms of the original god. And then they were merged together into this um, giant pantheon of gods over time. Over time, they were individual, and some of these were only worshipped in one or two cities to begin with. So as interaction occurred between these different cities, etc., they compared notes and began sharing their gods, etc. So um, and then the other thing is, the older the god is, the more basic the attributes. For instance, Zeus is the father of the sky. He has the thunderbolt as his weapon. He's called Cloud Gatherer, etc. By the time we get to Hermes, who's the last arrival of the Olympians, all the normal stuff is taken. So he becomes the most sophisticated god. He's the god of oratory eloquence. He's the god of taking the dead to the underworld, usually just the heroes. And so I want to talk a minute about the underworld. The underworld has three layers, three levels, the Greeks did not see death as moving to a place generally as moving to a place of reward or punishment. Instead, there were three levels. The primary one, Hades, is just a storage place for dead souls. And when people die and go into the underworld, they have to drink from the river Styx. And when they do that, it erases their memory of life on the earth, and they become what the Greeks constantly refer to as listless, gibbering ghosts. And that is seen in the Odyssey. They obviously don't drink right away from the Styx, however, because Odysseus goes into the underworld to check with some of his crew who have died to get information that he needs, and they have not yet drunk from the river Styx. So it's not something they do apparently immediately. So the Hades itself, which simply means that's a word meaning invisible. And certainly when you bury someone, they're no longer visible. And so that's just a storage place for dead souls. It's not a place of punishment or reward, although the Greeks love color and love life. And so being in the land of the gray, the land of the shades, where there is no color, they would see that as definitely not a positive experience, but not necessarily as punishment. For the individuals who commit particularly horrible crimes, they go into Tartarus, which is below Hades, and it is a place of punishment. And the Greeks didn't believe in eternal punishment very much, but when they did it right. However, the ones that are punished very often, their deed of punishment, that got them the punishment, would seem rather benign to us. Ixion is tied to a wheel, giant wheel, and it spins for all of life or all of eternity, because he gave up a secret of Zeus. Sisyphus is condemned to roll a giant boulder uphill, and every time he gets to the top of the hill, he slips and the boulder goes down to the bottom, and he has to start all over again. However, probably one of the ones that's my favorite is I'm having a brain cloud here.
Tantalus?
Pardon?
Tantalus?
Yes, thank you. I have these brain clouds from time to time. Tantalus, and the reason I like Tantalus committed a food crime against the gods, and that is he was favored by Zeus, and he was allowed to come to Olympus and to eat ambrosia and drink nectar. They didn't make him immortal. They did that involved some more ceremony, etc. He remained mortal, but he became arrogant because he had eaten ambrosia and drank nectar with the gods. And so he decided to trick the gods, and he invited them to a feast. And he killed his own son and cooked him and served him to the gods. And one of the goddesses, I think it was Artemis, I'm not real sure, I don't remember for sure, took a bite and knew immediately that this was a person. And it's Pelops is the son's name. And so the group, uh, cannibalism is abhorrent to the ancient Greeks. So having the gods take a bite of a human being was a greatest abomination. And so, first of all, they restored Pelops to life, but they could not replace the meat that was bitten by the goddess, and that was from his shoulder. And so they replaced his shoulder, the missing part, with ivory. And so he had an ivory shoulder. But then Zeus punished Tartarus by placing him in a pool of water that was up to his neck in Tartarus. And dangling right in front of him was a branch of delicious fruit. However, every time he reached for the fruit, the breeze would come and blow it just out of his reach. And every time he stooped to try to drink, the water would recede, and his feet were fastened to the bottom of this pool, so he could not move. And so for the rest of eternity, totally hungry and thirsty, he was tantalized by his punishment. So that's an example again of the severity of their punishments. That one was justified. So the third layer of the underworld actually comes back up into the upper world. That is, and this is reserved for heroes, only heroes. And so when they've done something like Achilles or Heracles, which most people know as Hercules, which is actually the Roman name, it doesn't mean anything, whereas Heracles means son of Hera, and there's a reason for that we'll talk about later. It was an insult, by the way. Just as the Greeks called cows were very sacred to the Greeks. They didn't have land that supported large animals, so goats and sheep were their primary domestic animals. So cows were pretty unusual, and so cows were associated with Hera, and they very often called her cow-faced Hera. And it sounds like an insult. And the statues of her very often actually gave her a cow's looking face. And that was actually a compliment to her. But yeah, he's called Heracles, meaning son of Hera, and we'll explain that a little bit later. Definitely, she was not the mother of Heracles. Um, so at any rate, these heroes then that die go into the underworld, then come back up onto an island called it'll come to me again. I've got to review some of this stuff. Been 10, 12, 14 years since I was in the classroom teaching it. But it is the land of reward. And because it's on an island up in the world, color and light and all the things that we experience as mortals were available to them every day. There's a beer actually named for this island, and I'm trying to remember what the name of it is. I may have to come back to you on that later, or it'll pop into my head at some point. So that's a little bit on the underworld. Any other questions?
And I'm not expecting to go back to the conversation and everything, but I just wanted you to know, Steve, that this is the first time. I mean, I'm aware that other religions like Hinduism and the Egyptians, with the exception of Amenhotep or whatever,
Mhm.
were polytheistic. But this is the first time I've ever thought of it and wanted to think about it in terms of functionality, cultural functionality. I've always
Mhm.
just thought, oh, well, they believed in a bunch and I don't, and but so that's why it came up about why would they want to have that many. So that you've got me on a whole new thing now that I've got to do some research on it.
Well,
Maybe you're
I'll throw
gonna
you
get
another. I'll throw you another piece of that.
uh-huh.
Another pronunciation of Zeus is Zeus, and that comes to us as Deus, God. And the later Greeks, many of them moved to a monotheistic point of view. And
Yeah.
so Zeus, Deus, was God. And that rolls over into the Christian faith as well.
And I don't want, I hope I don't offend anyone, but it then now in my brain it's popping up about all the saints in Catholicism. And was that because people just have this need to have individuals that they can go to that represent their own need or whatever? I mean, if they have a sick child, they want to, or if they have a, you know,
Well,
whatever that
yeah,
they want taken care of.
I was going to ask about that. I wonder how much of the Greeks need to assign things and that sort of thing was them reaching for a taxonomy to categorize the world around them in a way
Yes.
that would be later pursued more effectively in the Renaissance and by like the Victorians and stuff.
Yes, and
Uh,
that takes me back to my earliest statements as we started this whole affair, and that is that mythology really is ancient Greek science. It is their effort to try to understand the world. So when they experience wind, uh, they talk, and this is in the most primitive stages of this. They know from their ancestors that there has always been wind. So that means that there is an immortal being that can blow hard enough to make trees move, etc. So
okay.
that is very much the assignment of these elements of scientific explanation for their environment. So yes, this assignment of responsibilities, etc., is a merging of these different gods, etc. And you'll see that there's an overlap between the gods. Apollo, well, there's Hestia is the goddess of childbirth, Lilith serves Hunter as a goddess of childbirth, but Hera is also sometimes identified as a goddess of childbirth. So you'll see, and it depends on where they were being worshipped as to which attributes are given to those particular individuals. And then the temples, etc., that are built for those individuals, the oracles that are associated with them. And the oracles are not always built buildings. For instance, Zeus's oracles in the forest of Dodona, which is an oak forest, and oak trees are sacred to him. And the oracle there, the priest, listens to the rustling of the leaves to get the pronouncement from Zeus to give the answer to the questions being asked. And they did have different methods of coming up with the answers, the oracles did. And they might, for instance, kill a small animal, split it open, and read the entrails. Or some of them would watch formation of birds in the sky and glean something from that to answer these different things. So there's a great deal of that. But does that kind of answer your question, Linda?
Yeah, it does, because I'm thinking too about what Brian said. I was thinking, I've been reading a lot about psychology and the evolutionary idea that man has this built-in, he wants to be able to know exactly what's going on in order, because that's through survival. And so I'm thinking, this idea of classifying everything in our lives so we can know exactly what's going on. We know who's responsible. We know, it's a way of controlling our destiny.
Yep.
Stay alive
And
or not.
that's very much it. And it's our human characteristic that we despise death, we fear death probably, and that we then superimpose on our own lives what may lay afterwards. And then we get into religion, which is a whole different
Yeah,
ball of wax.
sure.
But the
Yeah.
bottom line is that yes, it plays a very significant role.
Well, this was their religion. Am I incorrect there?
No, it is their religion, but the Greeks are not particularly religious people, the ancient Greeks. They not like many of the other societies.
No.
For instance, Athena, the goddess Athena, her altar isn't even in the Parthenon. It's outside of it. So their religiosity, if that's such a word, is
Mhm.
not as significant as in most of the other cultures where the divine were sacred. No, the Greeks, Zeus is philandering all the time. They get mad, they make mistakes, they do all this kind of stuff. They're very
Oh,
human in their nature. And that is something that is very different from the other societies, including the Egyptians.
that's a fascinating distinction. I'll have to think about that some. Oh, as we go along and whatever, go to school or read or whatever, we get
Mhm.
this idea about what we think this is. And I've always thought of as a religion,
Yeah.
that they sacrifice to them in order to
Yeah.
get them to go
It
along.
was a religion. It was a religion, and but they're not, they didn't have the same level of fear, respect, whatever,
Okay.
that the other societies did. They made fun of their gods, they could laugh at them, etc. Now they pay a price.
Yeah.
Nemesis is the
Yeah,
goddess of retribution.
you don't get that so much like with, I'm thinking, Hinduism.
Oh no,
No, they respect their gods or their, yeah,
yeah,
actually
and you don't.
incarnations of or different ideas about whoever it is, Shiva or Vishnu or something. They have, they see them as different versions, I guess is my word for it. But
Yeah, and Hestia is a good example because Hestia is kept out of the myths because they're too seedy. She is too important to the daily life. She's the goddess of the home and the goddess of the Olympian goddess of childbirth, etc. She is one of the three sisters of from Cronus and Rhea. So you have the three brothers, Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, and you have Hera, Hestia, and Demeter.
yeah, it sounds like
So
the major differences is that the I'm just using Hinduism as an example. They seem to have a more fixed idea that they can count on their gods to be and act in a certain way, where it sounds like the Greeks are kind of, you never know what you're going to get, what they're going to
yeah, and
do.
it depends. And it depends very much on where you are in Greece as to what you're going to hear and who you're going to worship and who's important, etc. And that you'll see that reflected in my books, well, where they go and which deity is most important. Strymon tells the
Fascinating.
story of Hephaestus when they come to the island that is sacred to Hephaestus, etc. So that all plays a significant role in all of this, basically. Yeah. So
Thanks. That's
yes, it's
fascinating. Yeah, it's a
yeah.
whole bunch of
And
things I
I'll make
never.
another comment too. As I'm doing my research on the Egyptian mythology, which, wow, I'll tell you, it's so much more complicated than the
Yeah.
Greeks. It is. I am finding that um, they have specific things assigned to some of these gods, etc., but the gods are not anthropomorphized as readily as among the Greeks. The Greeks anthropomorphized their gods and made them very human in nature.
Yeah.
But the Egyptians, a god could have a human appearance, could have an animal appearance, it can be an eye, and it's all the same god or goddess. Um, Different reflections of those individuals. And so I found that mythology, as I'm studying it for the book that I'm writing now, becomes extremely complex. And I'm trying to, I guess, simplify it somewhat to be able to write about it at all in the books.
Well, I
Yeah.
wish you luck.
Yeah,
I
thanks.
think that's
I'm
a
going to need a lot.
worthy.
Are there any other questions? Because we're a little over the hour, so I didn't want to hold
My
people up.
fault. I apologize.
No, 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 that's fine. I really want to get people asking questions and having discussions because that's where the best understanding comes. So, unless there's an objection, first of all, I'm going to end the recording if I can. Okay, I guess I'll just do it by ending the meeting. Oh, here it is. Here's the stop. Okay.